Aaron, and thank you, and thank you to Opta for arranging this opportunity for these various webinars. It's a great thing to be able to do when we weren't able to have the Opta conference as originally intended. So let's get started. As you can all see, our title for our session here today is called Improving Operations with Technology. And that title is quite deliberate. You know, the focus is improving operations for transit agencies. Technology is just a means to an end. It's something that you do because you understand how it's going to help you improve operations, and because you feel like you've got ways to adjust how you do business to get the value out of that technology and to keep it doing its job. Now, there we go. So here today, I've gathered a set of presenters here today to present several different types of projects. They all have that common thread of improving operations using technology, but they're quite distinct. And I'm going to introduce each one of these as we progress through. So just first of all, to introduce myself, my name is Doug Parker. I'm a director with IBI Group, and I'm the senior practice lead for our transit technology consulting practice. And I'll just tell you a little bit more very briefly about IBI Group. Don't worry, just a slide or two here. So IBI Group is a large firm, a large architecture, engineering, planning, and technology firm. We do have nearly 3,000 staff, and we have over 60 offices. We operate around the world, and we have these core areas we call intelligence, buildings, and infrastructure, the I, the B, and the I. But these, our focus here today is transit technology, which is part of our intelligence sector practice, but it really involves, you know, bringing an operations perspective to bringing technology to transit agencies. And the main point this slide is showing is that, you know, our Toronto office is the largest office of IBI Group. It is the original office of IBI Group from when we started in 1974. We do have a large number of transit technology projects of many kinds throughout Southern Ontario. And with that, we'll get started with our first presentation of today. And I just wanted to take a moment then to introduce our first speaker from Regional Waterloo, Grand River Transit, Gethin Beniston. He's been with GRT since 2001. As a planner, his work is focused on annual service plans, fare changes, and UPass programs. As a project manager, he led the creation of GRT's electronic fare system. Currently, he's assistant manager in charge of technology maintenance. So he's leading major upgrades to their CAD-AVL system, and he's responsible for maintaining the fare system hardware, but also CAD-AVL equipment and all of their other on-vehicle and on-platform electronic systems. Gethin is a project management professional, and he has an MBA from Wilfrid Laurier. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen so that you can share yours, Gethin.
Okay, thanks, Doug. Wish me luck. Working?
We see it.
Sounds good. Okay, morning, everybody. I'm going to talk briefly about our electronic fare project. This was a huge project, so I'm going to skim over a lot of it really quickly and try to focus on it from an operations and a maintenance perspective. But to give you some background, I'll talk briefly about the scope of the project, the equipment we deployed, and some of the changes we went through as well. So to give you that necessary background, there we go. What we did was we replaced our paper passes and ticket-based system with a card-based smart card system. This integrated our UPasses using the university and college ID cards. We replaced our paper transfers with 2D barcode printed tickets from our fare boxes and from our vending machines. We replaced our old GFI fare boxes from the late 80s. And we integrated a proof of payment system for light rail. So on our light rail line, we don't take payment on the vehicle entry or have a fare paid zone. You're just required to show proof of payment if you're inspected. To do all that, some pictures of our fare media are on the screen, our 2D ticket, our limited use media, and our regular fare card. The equipment we added, well, as I mentioned, new electronic validating fare boxes, a web portal to revalue the cards, customer service terminals for our staff to load and issue cards, fare vending machines on our LRT platform validators on our LRT platforms, card readers for our security system, and basically a decade of my life in 2 or 3 sentences. We built the smart card system from 2015 to 2019 in order by deploying the fare box, because you can't give people smart cards without somewhere to tap them. And then we added the web portal, customer service terminals, trained our staff, rolled out the cards to customers. Once all that was in place, we kind of layered on the LRT equipment in 2018 and 2019. That was actually pretty quick, I think, for a smart card system deployment. And to give you an idea of how this rolled out, back in 2017, we were 93% flash passes and paper tickets. We started to transition our customers in 2018, mostly with our UPass partners. So 36% of our customers were on smart media by the end of 2018. And then 2019, with that hard deadline of the LRT coming, our customer service team made an amazing effort and got 80% of our customers over onto smart media that year. 2020, with significantly less volumes, but in terms of percentage, 92% of our customers are using smart media and 8% using cash. And that's it. We are a fully smart card-based system. Things we learned while going through that story.
Catherine, it's Karen. My apologies.
Right.
I would just ask you to speak up a little louder, or maybe bring the boom in closer to you, and then we'll be able to hear.
Sure, I'll project a little better. Thanks for
wonderful. Thank you.
So for our operations department, what we learned, we had to change our startup processes for our vehicles and write new SOPs. The old fare boxes they would start when you started the bus. Now it's a Windows computer and it has an on button, so it takes time, which means you can't leave the garage before the fare box has started. It needs to talk to the back end to find out about people's fare purchases and changes to UPasses. We integrated with our CAD AVL system, so the logon procedure changed. The data that moved between the two systems means that you log on to it, and then you log on in the morning, and then it handles the route changes during the day. We had to teach people that. They had to learn the sounds and the screen messages. So what does it mean? What is the positive tone? What is the negative tone? We demoed all this to our operators extensively, but learning to live with it was something completely different. And some of our bigger pain points were a slow transfer printer at first and slow coin validation. Much more accurate than the older fare boxes, but taking a little more time to get the coins through the validator and then time to print the tickets. Especially at first, we went from about 5 seconds to board a cash rider to about 25 seconds. So we knocked that down to 15, but it was definitely painful for our staff. In the maintenance world, we now replace paper rolls for printers. If the paper doesn't take properly during that procedure overnight from our service agents, the fare box doesn't boot properly in the morning. So we had to start a technician every day at 0500 to support the morning bus deployment, just to make sure. And these are Windows computers, so there's always one that doesn't want to start. So someone needs to be there for that. We're tracking defect rates on a much more complex device, where we used to just pull a fare box and fix it. Now we're pulling modules, diagnosing them on a bench, and sending them for RMA, and tracking the performance of all these components so we can stay on top of our vendor. We're dealing with validator firmware. With electronic validation comes the idea that if changes to the currency happen, you have to update your firmware, which in our system requires USB, and it takes about 6 weeks for one of our staff to get through all of the buses. And then Wi-Fi probing and network connections. The fare boxes probe via Wi-Fi. They send their data to the back end whenever they hit an access point. The garage is full of access points. When a service attendant taps their probing card, the fare box sends its sales data, opens its door. You pull the box. The system tells the back end which box came from that fare box, which vault did it go into, which person took it, how much money was in it, so we know what all the money is through the entire process. But that requires a rock solid network connection. So if we have any network issues overnight, revenue servicing starts to fail. In the end, we put a power switch on the main circuit to the vaults so that we could have a supervisor go in there and turn it all off, wait 10 seconds, and turn it all back on again to keep operations going, because computers and people, sometimes you just need a quick answer to keep production going. Our customers had to learn about online purchase processes, how to deal with fare media. What does it all mean? I bought a fare online. I paid with my credit card. Where is my fare? It's somewhere in the cloud on its way to my card. That was a big learning curve, especially for some of them. And how to learn to use the equipment. Smart card terminals, tapping, they're a little sensitive, especially fare boxes seem more so than others, but we had a whole range of devices for customers to learn about. Similarly, our customer service staff now had to learn to do database queries to support issue resolution. When someone comes in and says, I bought something, but I didn't get it, how do I find out where your purchase is in that process? And typically, we just make the customer whole and keep them happy in the moment, but then we're doing the database queries afterwards to substantiate that claim, and so we can track what we did. And we had to learn about the card data flow in the operations side. There's an interesting trust in technology story with our college cards where one morning the data transmissions to the buses failed, and 5,000 college students tried to get on that day and their cards wouldn't validate. So to support our students, we just let everybody ride that day. And within a couple of days, we had the issue fixed in the network systems and the fare boxes. But surprisingly, the issue seemed to persist out on those college routes. People kept showing up and their cards wouldn't validate. Turned out the solution to this technology issue was to deploy security staff to the routes with handheld card readers just to make sure everyone's card was correct. And in about an hour, it disappeared. The students were taking advantage of the fact that we didn't necessarily trust our technology anymore to get a few extra rides to school out of us. We now also maintain the platform equipment, so we've had to learn about fare vending machines. The thing you see on the screen with its guts hanging out is quite a complicated device. We change its paper. We have Brinks do the revenue servicing, and we sometimes fix it after that because sometimes it gets damaged. We do the first line maintenance, and we do the PMs twice a year. We learn about what we need to work on from the back end software, but also from customer service lines. And because these are unattended devices on LRT platforms, they're in the public eye. So we hear about it on Twitter really quickly when people are trying to be proactive about why they're not going to pass their fare inspection. So we get notifications from our customer service staff about complaints on Twitter, and we're typically there within the same service day to fix things. Our maintenance team had to add some new skills that weren't typical for transit, I think. We had to add a lot of network capability. We now have a sysadmin who's managing 350 plus networked Windows computers, where isolated or system-wide communications issues have immediate customer impact. We actually run 1.5 technicians on fare boxes, 1.5 technicians on TVMs. We have a network admin, a sysadmin running the actual back-end system. And we have a planner with extensive data mining skills dealing with Power BI to help us start to report on the 100,000 plus transactions we get out of the system daily. Not just for planners to have fun, showing what we can learn about cards, like how many active customers by fare class are running in the system and how often are they riding and on which routes, but also for customer service problems to help support our customer service taps when we see failed auto loads or when we have issues with credit cards refusing to authenticate correctly. And with credit debit payment comes additional complexity, although I highly recommend it because the money just basically started rolling in when we activated this. But it means we're dealing with card not present unattended web transactions, automated web transactions, card present transactions. We confused the heck out of our treasury department for a while we added a whole bunch of brand new capabilities to our payment systems and our payment processing at the region. Some of our equipment is in PCI DSS scope, so we learned about that as well. That would be the equipment on our fare vending machines. The rest of it is all contracted to the vendor. But yeah, again, the money is definitely worth the challenge. What are we adding to our system after this? working on that faith in the technology world that we learned from the college cards, working to reduce the defect rates and to continuously communicate with our stakeholders about those defect rates to show the system is working as it ought to and to show that we're improving it. We've provided also more information on the operator screen so that the operators can tell when they've got current data on their fare boxes. And we stationed a technician in the operators lounge every Friday for about 4 months to just sit and chat with them about coming changes and to get their feedback about how things were going. We took customer feedback as well during the launch of the web portal. We deployed changes to our web portal as a result of the suggestions we heard. And we found that was recursive because as soon as they saw we were paying attention, they immediately started to ask for more, which is great. It's keeping us busy. We're also, improving our reports and improving our data integration with other systems like CAD AVL to improve our reporting all the time. There's always more we can learn about this. Something worthy of note is tariff changes. I'll talk about this very, very quickly, but in the old world, you do tariff changes by getting approval for a fare product price and then selling it for that price effectively. In the electronic world, we're doing an application and a database change that in our system needs to be deployed beginning 2 months minimum before the date of the fare change. And I need minimum before that 6 weeks for the software developers to make it, which pushes me, I'm close to 12 weeks ahead of the fare change before when I need to have a definition of when that, what those fares will be. That's a bit challenging in our approvals timeline. We manage it every year. We also have to be mindful of the fact that testing should include regression testing because it's software. Sometimes, depending on what you're doing, it's like whack-a-mole. Something else breaks. You deploy a fare change and suddenly someone's card's not validating. So we have to have time to test everything before we go. In case you like graphs, just to give you an idea of the volumes we deal with, 100 to 120,000 transactions a day back in September of 2019 before everything changed. 85% fare box, the TVM may be the star of our show here in Waterloo region, but fare box is really doing most of the heavy lifting. TVM is 1% of our volumes. If you look very, very closely at the chart, you'll see on the 30th, there's an increase on our customer service terminals. People would come in for their passes. And on the 25th, there's an increase for our web portal as all of the auto reload passes get processed overnight that night. And then really everything else is just happening on average day to day. And there it all is. And we have it by day, time, product type, card class, route. So it's lots of fun for planners. What we're doing in the future, we're improving our maintenance dashboard. We measure our defect rates. It's the you had one job rule, which was to serve our customer and provide them with a fare. If your device failed to do that, then it's not in service. So we track that for our fare box as well as for our ticket vending machines and platform validators. We track our escalation rates to the second line maintenance, which is contracted to the vendor, and their resolution time to keep them honest. We score our platforms as critical, fair, and good based on the service quality. Is there an alternate device? Is it actually possible for a customer to do what they came there to do? And if it isn't, then we consider the platform to be out of service as well and call that our highest priority item for the day. Later this year, we're going to move that fare box to 4G by wiring Ethernet cables from all the fare boxes to our 4G routers to improve the data transmission to the fare boxes to make things easier for our customers. And based on our learnings through the deployment of the system, we're going to be improving our user interface on our TVM, partially from what we saw in Toronto and Ottawa on their TVMs, but also based on what our customers had to say as they went through learning to use these devices. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Gethin. I'm just going to change the screen back to okay. So when it comes to Karen mentioned this in the chat, but when it comes to questions, we're going to do them at the end of all the presentations. And I would invite everyone to go ahead and just type those questions into the chat box at any time. Alternatively, if you prefer to speak your question, you can always just unmute yourself when we get to that question and answer segment. Now, for our next presentation, we'll be speaking about the Sarnia electric bus feasibility study project. The folks from Sarnia Transit weren't actually available to be able to participate in this today, but we've got Seth McDermott, who was the IBI group project manager for it, so he's going to present about the project. Seth is one of our transit technology specialists at our Toronto office. So his experience includes a lot of work with deploying various kinds of planning and deploying various kinds of technology projects, all the different areas we work in, operations management, revenue collection, real-time customer information, and in recent years, fleet electrification has become a very important technology area. He's also got a lot of experience with doing business process re-engineering with people at the agencies to help them get the best value from the technology that they put in. So he's supported projects through their entire life cycle. It goes in from needs assessment and market research through the specifications development, and then supporting with procurement and implementation. So with that, Seth, if you could show your screen and take it away.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you, everyone. 1 second. All right, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Just wanted to say, Gethin, it was great to hear about GRT for a little while. Got a little bit of nostalgia. I worked on that project for several years, watching it get off the ground, and it's great to see it working in service now, and with so much uptake from everyone. But right now we're here to talk about the Sarnia electric bus feasibility study, which is a project that has just been wrapping up recently. This deck is pretty packed, but I'm not going to dwell on it for very long because I know the meeting is recorded. So, you can go back and have a look at content later. We have a variety of topics that we looked at through this study. I'll first give you just a brief overview of the premise of the study, get into some of the technology options that we looked at for the electric bus deployment, how we translated that into a service assessment for Sarnia Transit's existing services, then a facilities assessment where we looked at how they could integrate electric bus equipment into their existing maintenance and storage facility, then clarify which technology option they ended up selecting, and then look at the transition planning lastly, which involved various layers of the agency. So just as a brief overview, in case anyone doesn't know sort of the landscape for Sarnia Transit, serves the city of Sarnia, the village of Point Edward, and Amjanong First Nation with a pilot service. They've got a current fleet of 25 vehicles, including their conventional and specialized, and they run 14 fixed routes, one of which converts to a dial-a-ride service evenings, Monday to Saturday. All this is really important when it comes to electrification because you really need to know the landscape of the agency you're dealing with to know how electric buses are going to be able to perform on current services. Oops. So the study overview. Sarnia Transit is studying full conversion of their conventional and specialized fleets to electric vehicles. And the two options they were considering were either battery electric or fuel cell electric buses. Their existing assets and operations are really structured around diesel operation, as with a lot of transit agencies. And so pretty much every facet of their organization would require modification on some level to support electric buses. Really briefly, I know you may have an idea of what electric buses are, but some of the nuances as far as how they work, while everyone thinks about them using onboard batteries for their propulsion and their other vehicle systems, there may be some catches to that, like heating might be powered by a battery or a small diesel generator, especially in a Canadian climate, and so that was something to consider. Vehicle size also tends to correlate with the energy storage capacity, but not perfectly, because there's different kinds of battery types available, different battery chemistries, and each of those has a different capacity and different charging rates that it can accept power at. And also everyone thinks about them recharging through the municipal grid. There are projects that have these sort of publicly visible solar panels, solar arrays on top of the MSFs, but that's not really effective in a Canadian context for supplying a large amount of the energy that would be required to run these services. A typical battery can support slow and fast charging for a conventional fixed route bus. Slow charging tends to cut off at around 150 kilowatt hours, with fast charging being in the 300 plus range. But those rates again differ based on the battery chemistry. And there are these high capacity batteries that everyone's sort of talking about that offer denser energy storage, but the issue with them is their prolonged charging rate is limited in terms of their absolute battery capacity to about a third of the capacity. So that means that, you know, that they take a longer time to charge up. Typical equipment, you know, we can picture it, including I mean, the photos that everyone sees usually involve gantries overhead of charging spaces, but there's a lot more to it than that. First of all, you need a charger cabinet, which converts AC to DC power. And then the dispenser formats, the leading ones right now are plug style and the overhead pantographs that everyone's familiar with. For charging up to the 150 kilowatt range, the plug style and pantograph are both common, but above 150 kilowatts, the pantographs are more common, just because of electrical resistance, and also because when you're deploying it on the street, just a little more resilient to have that overhead style. Lighter duty electric vehicles like the caravans, so Sarnia Transit's paratransit service, typically charged around 22 kilowatt hours to 75 kilowatt hours, and they would use the plug style connectors. And there is a maximum distance constraint between the charger cabinets and the dispensers that gets into the facility design, where you can fit all of this equipment inside the current MSF. And it's common to add the recharging equipment at each parking space to reduce the repositioning required in the middle of the night. So on a fuel cell electric bus technology, you know, again, sort of intuitive, but just as a background, the fuel cell configuration is similar to a battery, but it uses consumable hydrogen instead of an electrode that's permanent inside the battery. And it can be carbon neutral, but it depends on the hydrogen generation method. A lot of hydrogen currently commercially available is actually reformed from methane from fossil fuel extraction processes, so that detracts from the carbon neutrality versus something that's cleaner, but a lot more energy intensive and expensive, like electrolysis of water, where they split water into the hydrogen and oxygen components. They refuel at stations that are similar to a compressed natural gas bus or a diesel bus, really more similar to CNG because you're dealing with a compressed fuel. And they refuel within a similar sort of order of magnitude duration, minutes rather than the hours that you would see for a battery electric bus. And the range is close enough to diesel buses. It's not perfectly, but it's close enough to diesel buses that it allows more services to run without modification than battery electric. And we'll get into that in just a second. So beyond that, there is, specific to Sarnia, they had a couple of considerations when it came to technology replacement. For the battery electric bus option, there was a consideration of whether they wanted to use their current fleet, which included 27-foot cutaway 27-foot cutaway vehicles, whether they wanted to use that as the model for their new fleet and purchase electric vehicles, or absorb that fleet into their 35-foot subfleet. And that procurement decision was driven by a cost difference. It's certainly lower cost to purchase the 27-foot cutaways, but also there's an issue with those vehicles' performance. They're limited in terms of their adoption on the Canadian market so far. Some of those vehicles are just sort of coming online this year, and so there's limited data on exactly what they'll be like performance-wise. And they also have a lower range than full-size battery electric buses. So it can impact their ability to cover service for as long of a period. On the hydrogen fuel cell side, there was consideration around consolidating the fleet into a 40-foot model. And that has to do, again, with the vehicle availability. Hydrogen buses are even more limited on the market than battery electric buses right now in the Canadian context. So in order to envision what the fleet would look like, we needed to use data from vehicles that are currently on the road in enough quantity to get a sense of what people are experiencing with them. So we envisioned a transition that potentially could use 27-foot cutaways in the battery electric bus option, or potentially consolidate them into the conventional fleet. And then for the fuel cell electric bus option, consolidate everything into 40 feet, except for the caravan services, which have specialized needs by running into driveways and things at seniors' residences, that kind of thing, where you can't really fit a full bus through there. So the service assessment level, once we had those parameters established, we looked at the properties of the vehicle, and we assumed that the battery or the fuel cell would supply 100% of the power requirements on board. We didn't want to use one of those diesel onboard heaters because we wanted to really keep it pure from the perspective of carbon neutrality, to see what it would actually take to get to 0 carbon emissions at tailpipe. Vehicle performance was investigated on the current services based on these sort of escalating utilization levels that you see on the table below. And that has to do with, you see propulsion and heating columns there. Propulsion has to do with a variety of things, so passenger loading, how many people are on board the bus, weather conditions, so how slippery the road is. Different routes have different propulsion characteristics just because of the stop and go nature of the traffic. And then on the heating side, that's related to just a temperature. So at the low end where there's 0 kilowatt hours, that would be like a spring day when you don't really need to use the heaters, versus high utilization, which is like January depths of winter heating. And then we looked at the performance for future operational scenarios. We focused more on a midpoint of the average and high utilization scenarios, because we figure really what we're trying to look at is the most constrained case. And if the service will work in the dead of winter, it will work in the rest of the year. So we looked at zero emissions technology on the current service. Battery electric buses, we found that most of their current services were not feasible under any weather conditions. Feasible blocks, the only blocks that were feasible included midday layovers. For the fuel cell electric bus option, most services were feasible under average weather, but it decreases under the extreme weather conditions. The graph on the right shows for the battery electric bus option, you can see the blocks that actually do manage to make it through their whole day sort of collect at the right under full power, if you can see my mouse, and the rest of the blocks just kind of crash and burn. And this option assumes that all of the blocks were able to recharge in the middle of their run. And the one thing that, yeah, they had all in common is that they included midday layovers in the garage where they actually had a chance to recharge without redesigning any of the services. So we looked at future operational scenarios from there. We developed 2 different scenarios that you can see here, and we also imagined doubling this to run it with and without the 27-foot cutaways in the fleet. Scenario 1 was all charging happening in the MSF. Scenario 2 was mixed charging in the MSF and en route. And both options required a degree of service redesign, because Sarnia Transit services, well, certainly for the layovers coming back to the garage, you would need to service redesign in any context, because buses would need to be swapping in and out. But for the mixed MSF and en route charging option, that actually also required a service redesign, because Sarnia Transit's current services only allow for about a 1 to 2 minute layover at the end of each trip. There's more recovery time that's sort of informally in the schedule, but not really evident or built in. And so that's not really sufficient for en route charging on its own. So we had to instead introduce these longer charging layovers at terminals, which actually ended up resulting in a similar schedule as if buses had returned to the MSF, just because Sarnia operates on a 30-minute pulse frequency. So there's only so efficient you can get with that, right? It's like you either have 30 minutes or an hour to charge, regardless of where you're relocating to. The only difference was with a couple of kilometers between the terminal and the MSF. And so under both scenarios, the results roughly looked like this. This is without 27-foot cutaways in the fleet. We were able to make all services work. We added 2 additional blocks into the service plan that weren't there before. And those blocks act as helpers to bail out all of the other blocks and give them chances to charge. And this is the option that worked with the 27-foot cutaways. So you can see there's a third sort of category or tier of charge levels at the start and end of the day. For fuel cell electric buses, we looked at average weather conditions. Weekday and Saturday services were fine as is, except they needed a little bit of trip reassignment between blocks just to shorten a couple of the long ones. But other than that, they were fine. And Sunday was 100% fine as is. In extreme weather conditions, the trip redistribution was also carried out. We needed to add one additional helper block in there because not all of the trip reassignment could fit within the current block schedule. And that block was introduced for every service day. And the refueling opportunities for fuel cell electric buses that we looked at were either at the MSF as the default case, or there was the alternative option to have sort of an innovative relationship with a partner hydrogen refueling supplier, where the buses might be able to go and refuel offsite. Now, the reason why they might consider that will become evident in just a minute when we get to the facility analysis.
Seth, I'm going to ask you to wrap up within 5 minutes, okay?
Yep, no problem. So from the operating cost analysis perspective, we looked at the operating costs for both options. We found that in general, the battery electric bus option came out with lower cost to achieve the carbon neutrality that we were looking for. Monthly energy cost was between $7,500 and $12,500, approximately, order of magnitude costing for the high utilization scenario, versus fuel cell electric, which had about $8,000 to $36,000 cost. And the cap at the lower end of that scale is that hydrogen would be fossil fuel derived, which again is not really suiting the carbon neutrality aims of the project. So we look at the facility. This is a view of the current MSF, just in midday thereabouts on a weekday. So the facility is currently configured with 45-degree angle parking. It was modified at some point from longitudinal parking. So they blocked up a bunch of the end doors for the entrance and the exit. There was a prior report that we had received at the beginning of the study that indicated the facility might have limited remaining life. And so we determined that it was unlikely to be worth modifying without a higher level decision on the facility direction. So all of the consideration of charging or refueling equipment was to be made to be as light as possible to avoid sort of sunk cost in the facility. And there are reasons for that assessment listed below that you can look back on. So we looked at layout options for battery electric buses, which included keeping the angle parking versus reverting to a longitudinal parking. And that was based on the size of the vehicles that you could position in the building. This is sort of a quick view of what we considered the maximum packing condition inside the building to be. In all of the options that we looked at for battery electric buses, we saw that there was some spillover into the maintenance bays where buses would have to be stored there overnight, whether or not they were actually undergoing maintenance. But that was just a reality of keeping the angle parking. Longitudinal parking, you could fit more buses in, but it would require putting the equipment in the middle of the floor between the lanes. Fuel cell electric, we determined that they had to reconvert to the longitudinal parking because if they're using a full fleet of 40-foot buses, the angle parking just doesn't fit anymore. So Sarnia Transit's chosen path was they went with battery electric bus for the cost considerations and also the market maturity of the technology. Alternative strategies to resolve the sort of the uncertainties of the 27-foot cutaway option, which are currently being considered by Sarnia Transit, so I can't give an update on exactly what they've decided to do, but alternatives would be to look for funding through the Canadian Infrastructure Bank or Infrastructure Canada to try to achieve that 30-foot battery electric bus condition, because that is preferable to using 27-foot cutaways from the perspective of the number of additional services that you need to add. Adding 27-foot cutaways requires 5 additional blocks during a day versus, 4 additional blocks during the day versus 2 for the 35-foot buses. They could also postpone a decision waiting for the market for 27-foot cutaway electric vehicles to mature and for other agencies to develop more statistics on their use. And then also accelerate a discussion on the future of the current facility, considering whether they want to replace it more quickly than they were planning on. And the configuration they selected was to go with the angle parking layout because it allows the installation of the equipment to be a lot more simple. You don't need to put anything in the middle of the floor. You put all the chargers and dispensers around the perimeter of the storage area. It reduces potential for conflict with vehicles. So when we now established all that, we looked at the transition planning, the bus procurement. We looked at their spare ratio and what they would need to run with battery electric service. We recommended that they consolidate their up to 4 different subfleet types into 2 super groups that could sort of depend on one another or support one another. And that was to, again, reduce the crowding in the facility. The proposed approach to fleet replacement, we looked at having transition years that weren't really tied to a specific calendar date. And that's because we're seeing a lot of delayed lead times for battery electric bus ordering and delivery in Canada, anywhere from 12 to 18 months, sometimes even 2 years to get the buses on site. And so we want Sarnia Transit to be aware of that ahead of time, that, they might need to factor that into their replacement timeline. And noting that it would be better for them to try to structure as few procurements as possible, because even though technology is converging towards standards, it's not really seamlessly interchangeable yet. So managing fewer brands of equipment on top of the different subfleets they want to manage is definitely going to be in their interest. From the infrastructure growth works side, we looked
Seth,
at—
just take a minute to wrap up. Okay.
Sure. So we looked at different scenarios for MSF-based charging or en route charging to install all the equipment within phased installation time period. Cutting up the facility into a variety of subcomponents, and you can sort of have a look at this on your own time, because it's not really worth going through here, to result in a full scenario. I will skip a couple of these because it's less important. We looked at change management just for every area of the agency to be able to make the transition effectively, focusing on safety, looking at transitioning the training and the awareness of skills for the different departments in the agency. And then lastly, we looked at service planning and operations. We had an evaluation period that we recommended Sarnia Transit look at, so build into their vehicle replacement timeline, and look at how to restructure their blocks so that different services can support one another. And then we recommended at the very end that transitioning to battery electric buses is a visible process that members of the public will notice. And so that trying to stage the transition in a way that members of the public will be able to appreciate and help build support for the transition is always beneficial. But that also, in addition to looking at services that would be popular and visible, to consider the health equity implications of transitioning to battery electric buses, and looking at services that might serve areas of the cities that are home to communities that have been sort of historically exposed to higher levels of air pollution. And I think that is it. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Seth. We'll move on to switching screens here. Okay, so hopefully everybody's seeing that our next presentation is from Anthony Pezzetti about the Metrolinx Union Station bus terminal. I would quickly note, by the way, we had to go through a couple of the slides quickly there. I'd say for that presentation Seth has made, and for any of the other presentations, you can let myself or Karen know, and I'm sure we can arrange to get out a copy of the PowerPoint. And I think the presentation itself is being recorded and distributed, but that wouldn't help so much with slides that had to be gone through quickly. So with that, I see we've got Carlos. You can go ahead and, oh, it looks like he already has. Okay, and Anthony, you can go ahead and get started. Now, before you do, I will just quickly give a little intro. Almost forgot that. So Anthony Pezzetti has worked in public transportation for over 20 years. The last 15 with Metrolinx. So at Metrolinx, Anthony's worked in rail operations and bus operations. and his most recent experience was as the lead for delivery and readiness of the new Union Station bus terminal. Not sure how many of you have had a chance to be in it physically yet, but it's very impressive if you've seen pictures of it, as you will today, and hopefully we all get a chance to spend more time there really soon. It is the world's first multi-level, multi-carrier, dynamic platform and traffic managed facility. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Anthony.
Very good. Thanks, Doug. And welcome, everyone. Thanks for taking the time out of your busy days to listen in. Obviously, the USBT, there's a significant amount of technology, but we're going to be focusing in on one key area, which I'll share with you in a minute. I just wanted to give you a bit of a background about how Union Station Bus Terminal itself all worked in terms of Metrolinx's delivery and the overall methodology we used. Obviously, you know, our I&IT groups would have led specific technology projects for the technology inside the actual facility. And of course, our construction teams would have led the actual delivery of the facility. I had the honor of gluing it all together so that there was an integrated approach, both in terms of construction delivery, negotiating with our landlord. For those who don't know, the terminal is actually a leased space within Ivanhoe, Cambridge and Hines 56-story CIBC square. So another unique sort of nuance in terms of delivering. And then, of course, we had the luxury of trying to deliver this all within the midst of a global pandemic. So the program itself essentially started back in 2012 when the Treasury Board submitted an application that the City of Toronto needed an upgraded terminal. For those who have been up to 610 Bay Street, the old Metro Toronto gray coach terminal, number one, old, not particularly convenient, landlocked. I know from my colleagues, it would take upwards of 45 to 60 minutes just to get out to a highway at certain times of the day. Not a particularly good experience for our customers or for operations. So there was a need to amalgamate a new customer-centric facility close to the highways, and that's what this terminal essentially delivered. We wanted an indoor climate-controlled facility, direct indoor connections to the balance of Union Station campus. So that includes Via Rail, Go Rail, the Union Station Express, Union Pearson Express, Scotiabank Center, TTC Subway, and that is what essentially was delivered. Doug mentioned the terminal management system, vehicle detection and traffic control. That's going to be coming later in 2021, and that will make this terminal the first of its kind, because buses will be controlled in a manner very similar to a controlled rail network, where through the use of RFID sensors, buses will be given priority allocation to move through the terminal. And based on when the buses arrive at the actual facility, the system will analyze and determine which platform the bus will go onto and automatically update the digital signage as well as the PA announcement so customers know exactly where to go. Just really going to quickly touch on some of the overall layout and operations. Of course, it is 2 floors. We have 7 customer-facing platforms on each level, so 14 in total, 6 layover bays inside. It is one way. For those who have been to the Port Authority in New York, kind of a mini version of that. When customers come to the terminal, if they come really early, we direct them to zones. So zones are groups of platforms, groups of 4. And then if you come at the last minute, once the bus is detected and the final platform allocation is assigned, you'll be guided straight to that platform. It was a bit of a compromise between our customer experience and marketing. Our customers do like to have certain element of consistency in their lives. So by having a grouping of platforms, we can place buses that are going to similar destinations from a similar area within the terminal on a consistent basis, instead of them showing up every single day and wondering where they're going to catch their bus. If you've had a chance to go in, you've probably already realized it looks and feels very much like an airport. And if you haven't had a chance, you'll probably notice as soon as you walk in that that is essentially what the facility feels like. Can we go to the next slide, Carlos? Just a real quick overview of the timescale. So the formal program itself started in 2018, and that's when we really dove into the operational readiness, the change management elements. The facility construction had proceeded to a point where we really needed to start understanding and updating our standard operating procedures, what the policies for the facility would look like. Our original go live date was supposed to be early in 2020. That obviously didn't happen because of a few things. Number one, there was a few trades that had gone on strike, and that led to some production delays in terms of the actual construction. The pandemic itself resulted in about a 1/3 loss in production for construction. The various trades were keeping themselves segmented, so you wouldn't have multiple trades working in the same space at the same time. And because it was a lease space with a complex commercial agreement with the developer, we really needed to land on when substantial completion was going to be complete before either party agreed to move into the new facility. And for those who have been downtown Toronto, remember the old Union Station bus terminal just north of the tracks. Part of that commercial agreement was that we would vacate the old terminal so that Ivanhoe, Cambridge, and Hines could start development of the second phase of CIBC Square, which is going in that landscape. So we needed a level of assurance that we could move to the new facility in a manner that was safe for our operation, safe and convenient for our customers, and would provide us with the operational resilience. So we landed on December 5th, 2020. Our terminal management system vendor has experienced some more technological challenges, and that's why our plan right now is that TMS will go live this fall, somewhere in October, November. And the last mark there with Coach Canada, we've already started the integration of intercity carriers moving from 610 Bay Street. You've probably seen in the news that 610 Bay Street actually is now officially closed. Once Ontario Northland moved out at the late part of June, they were the last legacy carrier to operate from that facility. So any additional carriers coming into the city of Toronto are working with us, and there's a high likelihood that they would be servicing the new Union Station bus terminal. Next page. So this is where I'm going to get the focus of the technological aspect of the USBT program. And really what our focus is around a virtual reality environment. So we generated 3 unique tools out of this virtual reality. Those tools being a 360 web-based interactive walkthrough. For those who have bought a house or are just curious in real estate, you probably notice nowadays a lot of realtors use 360 cameras and go through houses, so you can essentially walk through the house yourself from home. This was very much the same concept. We created a couple of videos specific for our drivers, as well as then what the customer experience would look like. A virtual reality simulator, which is actually a really cool tool, and then a little bit of future tweaking to that VR technology. So with the interactive walkthrough, where we found this really important, so there's 2 aspects. There's around our operational readiness framework. So we had over 200 different operational readiness elements, as well as another 100 change management elements. For those who don't realize the complexity of our operation, we have multiple business units. So obviously bus operations, bus fleet maintenance, operating on the roadside. Our station services group are accountable for the customer experience on what we call here the ground side. If you think about an airport, ground side, air side, so the customer space that you see right now, as well as our transit safety officers. So our transit safety, transit security, they need to know quickly where things are, how to find key spaces. If a customer was in distress, how could they quickly get to them? How can they access back of house spaces? And with an active construction site that was being impacted both by the pandemic and just the fact that there were some competing timelines, this environment allowed us to kickstart in a very robust manner the amount of training, orientation. We've provided these tools through seminars and workshops. We've provided the tool to business associations in the local area. We have a mandate internally to include integrated art, where we partner with local artists as part of improving the space, making the space more social. And this allows our marketing groups to reach out to various vendors. And instead of having to try and congregate within the space, you can get an early understanding of the geographic nature of certain segments, whether it's wall space, floor space, glass space. And you basically only have to come into the actual terminal for potential tours, disruptions, once you have a really good idea of what you want. The environment itself is from the engineering drawings. So what you see is extraordinarily close to real life. We even, through surveys, staff surveys and customer surveys, everybody was shocked at how real it was. Once the terminal was getting close to a point of completion and they were able to walk in for a formalized orientation, they couldn't believe how similar that environment was. So this was an absolute key tool that we are going to continue to use for new staff, standard operating procedure tweaking, adjusting. And what it does is it allows us to control, be in a controlled environment instead of having to bring staff initially into a construction site. And now, as we plan on, more personnel, things get busier, people can get a really good idea of the layout, where things are located, and how to provide wayfinding and service to our customers before they actually get into the actual space. Using the same environment, we created 2 videos, and these videos were pushed out both internally and externally early. A lot of it was based on change management experiences. With over 800 drivers, another 100 transit safety officers, another 100 station attendants, customer service officers. We really wanted to get their buy-in and understanding of what the facility would look like early. In addition to a series of town halls through our various garages, we made sure that this video was readily accessible through our internal web-based MyLinks site, and so that drivers could get a really good idea of what their future experience would look like. On the customer side, the video was also marketed towards our customers, because we knew there was going to be a significant change, not only for our internal staff, but our customers. And we wanted our customers to start sort of embracing and adapting and looking at the real positive elements of moving the terminal to a new space by seeing what their experience would actually look like. They could potentially ask some early questions, and we could also map out, are there certain areas of change management that we need to focus more strictly on because it's what our customers are telling us instead of what we assume our customers are going to look and feel. Then the actual virtual reality tool was an absolute key element of part of our training. So I just mentioned we have over 800 drivers. It was identified early on because of the significant operating change within this terminal compared to any of the other terminals in our system. We really wanted to bring drivers to the space, but understanding that the facility was under construction. Again, I can't stress enough, there were competing interests in terms of timelines and delivering the facility. It was identified early on that bringing all 800 drivers into the space for a formal orientation was not going to be feasible without significantly impacting the ability for construction to complete. So we pivoted early, and instead of bringing our drivers to the terminal, we decided to bring the terminal to them. And so what you see on the screen right now is where we ultimately landed. And a lot of that, again, is it's a bit of a compromise due to the pandemic. And you'll see on the next slide here, there's a couple of different iterations in terms of what the tool looked like. So on the top right, you actually see what the original tool was intended. And that is like a real virtual reality environment where you strap the goggles on, you turn your head right, left, up, down, and you can actually see everything that's around you in the space. You can look towards your mirrors, you can look at a marshal helping you back up. And the big screens in the background would be where our safety and training instructors or supervisors would actually be talking you through the various steps and making sure that you're looking at specific items, which as part of the development of the software, they're already like flashing lights, and there's a text that's, or an audio text that's going on in the background to help remind the user of key points that they're supposed to be aware of. And so our safety and training group, they incorporated this into the training curriculum. The other screens are where we landed. And again, being in a pandemic, because of the concerns about droplets and sharing tools, it's a bit easier to sanitize and clean steering wheel. But we were highly anticipating that people would be a little bit antsy about sharing goggles, regardless of what type of cleaning we could provide. So we moved to a larger curved screen that would provide a very similar experience, but without, you know, the potential perceptions of sharing something that's going over your face. So the hardware itself was not significantly expensive. Without the goggles, you're looking in and around $3,000 to $5,000. So we work closely with our INIT, so that way the hardware would be supported through standard technology that's across our organization. The actual tool itself, because of the complexity of it, is in and around $400,000 mark. That's for the software development time to actually get the environment. But I really stress the importance of the scope and magnitude that this tool allowed us in terms of training our staff, helping us build out our operational readiness framework. So we could actually conduct a few exercises or get people accustomed to what they're experiencing or what they're feeling before we got into the actual terminal. And then that huge element of change management, which I'm sure everyone on here knows, one of the biggest points of failure for every organization out there is how they manage change, how they bring all of the staff along through that change lens, and helping them as much as possible in terms of understanding, you know, how is this going to impact me? What am I going to need to know? Am I going to be prepared on day one when I go in? And we heard across the board from all the different businesses how these various tools really helped and gave everyone a really good sense of how the terminal is going to work, what it looks like. And when they walked in for the first time, it felt like they had already been there. Now, we are working to upgrade our virtual reality because it is going to be a legacy tool that we are keeping. And we're upgrading it right now with terminal management system technology, so that because we're going to bring in our staff once again, especially the drivers, and this is going to be an opportunity for them to train, understand how TMS is going to work, understand how the vehicle detection and traffic control is going to work, and they can see, look, feel, and touch how the USBT will work with TMS and vehicle detection, traffic control in a safe environment where, through the assistance of a safety and training instructor, they can make a mistake. It doesn't damage anything. It doesn't lock down the terminal. They can hit the reset button. And it's an opportunity for the various participants in the same class to understand and learn at the same time. We'll also provide this tool to the various third-party carriers if they wish to use it. And again, it's all about making sure that there's appropriate level of training and an appropriate level of sign-off, because we do expect all carriers, before they start their live operations in our terminal, to sign off that they have trained their staff with our provided material and that they are fully confident in that everybody clearly understands what our operating procedures and rules are. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Anthony. Let me just switch the screen over here. Can take a moment to introduce our final presentation of the day about the Breslau On-Demand project, On-Demand Transit Project in Region of Waterloo. So first of all, let me introduce our two speakers. Will Towns is the principal planner with Grand River Transit in Region of Waterloo. So in his years with GRT, he's gained a variety of experience. He's been planning, implementing, and monitoring on-demand or various alternative transit services in the region. and he does various other development review and service planning tasks, of course. Prior to joining the region, he worked in the private sector and also for District of Muskoka in areas like active transportation, land use, and policy planning. Supporting Will today is David Forsey with IBI Group. He's a transportation and transit planner. He's a manager in our transportation planning practice in the Toronto office. So he was IBI's project manager for this project we'll be discussing today. He's also managed to contribute to a lot of diverse strategic planning and travel forecasting studies all around North America. A number of transit service planning assignments in Ontario include those for Peterborough, Myway, Tillsonburg, Haliburton, and Brantford. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Will.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. That's great. Appreciate the introduction. I'm just going to share my screen here. Okay. All righty. Yeah, so thanks everyone. My name's Will, as Doug says. Yeah, so I'll be here today to speak a little bit about our alternative service delivery, or more colloquially, on-demand transit sort of program area. Now, just a little bit of background, I guess, about GRT. So you got some of that from Gethin earlier, but generally, we're a mid-sized transit agency. We deliver service to the cities of Cambridge, Kitchener, and Waterloo. We do some rural service to our townships as well. And of course, most prominently, we've recently launched a light rail line that connects Kitchener and Waterloo, and we're planning for extension into Cambridge within the next decade. And as sort of part of that endeavor, we've begun to experiment with these alternative forms of transit. And they, rely upon various technologies right from planning through to implementation. So this is an area I've been heavily involved in, and it's fitting because this particular project involves all the agencies that are represented here on the panel today. We're talking about an on-demand pilot for the community of Breslau, but this work is being supported by Metrolinx, and some detailed scenario planning was conducted, quite capably by David and his colleagues. So, it's a good sort of coming together of all the participants here. And I should mention also that Via Transportation, their software was sort of at the heart of what David did, and he'll dive over into that type of stuff. I'll pass the proverbial microphone to him later on. But first, I'll just sort of touch on some key elements here of this program area that I was just describing. So what is alternative service delivery for transit? At GRT anyway, this really stems from our network redesign that took place in tandem with the launch of light rail in 2019. There's a big bus network redesign, which brought a lot of service off of local roads. We streamlined quite a few routes at the expense of some coverage, but what this did, I suppose, was sort of shine the spotlight on some areas that maybe were challenging to serve with transit. Maybe they feature some community services, some concentration of population and jobs, but maybe there's some elements that challenge conventional service, right? So it's circuitous street networks. Maybe they're cut off from the rest of the transportation network by a river or a highway or some other physical barrier, or maybe they're just not high enough ridership to serve effectively with conventional service. So to deal with these issues, our business plan stipulates that we ought to try some other approaches to delivering service. So enter our ASD portfolio. We launched 3 pilots that I'll just sort of skim over here. Various functionalities. We had a subsidized taxi service. We had a ride sharing service. We had sort of a community bus that operated on demand. And we did eventually move away from all these 3. Now we do have some routes that retain some flex or on-demand elements, some stops that are served upon request only. But just as this program area went into hiatus at the end of 2019, Metrolinx approached us with an offer to run another pilot. We elected to focus on a bit of a different area than some of the other pilots that we tried. We're focusing on Breslau here, and I'll show you a map in a second, but effectively this is a new growth area. So, an area without, an existing culture of transit, no other options, this type of thing. That was a challenge we ran into in some other areas. People were, maybe walking a little bit further to their route and this sort of thing. But this is an area where, we know that there's a lot of growth happening. We know that there is some demand now. So, we're looking at on demand as sort of a first step here. And of course, Metrolinx does have an interest in this area as well. There's a GO station that's planned to be constructed here with a bit of a park and ride element. So, there's that, but then there's also sort of the the need to trial this concept and for both parties, both GRT and Metrolinx, to get a sense for whether or not this type of service can work in this context. So we embarked upon some public engagement here in late or mid to late last year, and we carried that through over the winter. In a COVID context, we did a lot of online surveying, sort of iterative surveying, building upon previous findings. We interviewed a lot of representatives from community organizations, major employers, other types of institutions, and of course residents. And we did some virtual workshops, and we got a lot of great information and this sort of thing. But what became apparent to us after we did that engagement was that we didn't have a really strong degree of confidence in our demand forecasting, our scenario planning for on demand. So enter IBI and their existing relationship with VIA. And so, they used their expertise and acumen to develop some really robust sort of technology-driven scenario planning. And this is sort of the focus of the presentation today. And it's what David will be talking about when I flip it over to him in a moment. But again, just to introduce you to Breslau a little bit, this is the area that we're talking about. This is on the east side of the region here. So downtown Kitchener would be, sort of off to the left side of the map here. And if you were to follow this this service boundary here, which is preliminary at this point, but gives us a general sense of the area we'll be serving. If you follow this orange line across Highway 7, you get to Guelph. So, and of course you can also see the Grand River there. So that's sort of one of those barriers that I was talking about. Now it's home to about 4,500 to about 5,000 people, growing all the time. These are sort of the residential areas here. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but there's quite a bit of growth happening. There's the region of Waterloo International Airport. There's a major meat packing plant that employs quite a few people as well. So, a pretty substantial constituency of potential riders, excuse me, including a really well-used flight school at the airport, which serves a lot of students and this type of thing. So, like I said, we did some engagement, and these are some sort of key elements that we know we need to focus on. Obviously, given the geography here, we need to connect to our fixed route network. We want to do that in a way that's as seamless for our users as possible. We know that we need to balance a variety of needs, different shift start and end times, bell times for school, all sorts of different things. So we've got some challenging trade-offs to make and this sort of thing. This is a pilot. Our budget is limited and whatnot. And then we know that we also need to, not just appeal to those with smartphones. We need to be able to provide some options for calling in and this type of thing, but also, maximize the actual efficiency of the service. So that's kind of where we're at. And I'll just touch on this quickly. These are our sort of general objectives here. We want to make sure that our customers are first, that the service is as seamless as possible. I mentioned that a moment ago, but what that really means is having a bit of a one-stop shop in terms of customer information, through the app. Is it easy and convenient to transfer to our higher frequency fixed routes? That's going to be really at the key or at the core of making this work. We know that this needs to be sort of an efficient service that matches or falls into our hierarchy of our family of services on a reasonable cost per boarding basis. And of course, probably most importantly, what we're trying to do here is demonstrate proof of concept, especially because, we moved away from some previous efforts. Is this the type of service that can work in this context? Establish a relationship with a software provider that's going to continue over the longer term. And this was sort of the basis upon which we handed the project over to David and his gang. So David, I'll pass it over to you and just let me know when you want me to flip the slides, okay?
Will do. Thanks, Will. So I'm going to start by giving an overview of the methodology that we use to develop the high-level service design for the pilot. As Will mentioned at the top of the presentation, Metrolinx is providing a fixed amount of funding for the pilot. This gives us a starting point because we know that the net cost to operate the system can't exceed that budget, which is about $125,000. We know from a scan of practical experience, including that of GRT, that comparable on-demand services like the one being contemplated here tend to recover about 10% of their operating costs from the fare box. And if you do the math, that gives us a gross operating budget of just under $140,000. So it's very much a top-down process. We have a fixed amount of money that we know we have to spend, and we need to construct scenarios to be able to use up that pilot budget. So with that roughly $140,000 budget in hand, we can now determine how many operating hours we have to play with. So using an hourly operating cost that was supplied by GRT, it's a pretty easy math to figure out what the maximum number of service hours are that can be available for the pilot. And for what it's worth, that was about 1,600 hours that we had to play with. Once you know the number of service hours, that allowed us to develop different scenarios that we could use to split up those hours. And again, that lets you vary things like the number of vehicles, the service span for the service days, weekend versus weekend, and the duration of the pilot itself. So we came up with 3 contrasting scenarios and evaluated them against a number of metrics that I'll present in a minute. To help support that evaluation, we brought in the consulting arm of Via Transportation, who some of you may be familiar with as a software and logistics provider in the transit space, and particularly with on-demand transit. And their role was really to provide the demand forecast in the study area based on their practical operating experience, and then to run those forecasts through their microsimulation platform to be able to measure the performance of each scenario. And then with metrics and performance for each of the 3 scenarios, we were able to recommend one to carry forward for implementation. Next slide, please. But before we could get into the details of scenario development, there was a number of practical assumptions and approaches that we needed to work out in consultation and in conjunction with GRT. So number 1 was the operating model, who was going to run the service and using what vehicles. And it was determined that thanks to a convenient contractual arrangement that GRT already had in hand, it was determined that existing GRT contractors could run the service. They were already contracted to be able to provide drivers and operators at a fixed cost, and would be perfect for this kind of short-term project. Next consideration was the location and format of stops. So this could range, for example, from fully door-to-door, like specialized transit service, to service that would only be at stops with a physical fixed location. We determined that the ideal way to run the system would be through virtual stops, which really means that stop locations would be variable and that riders would be given instructions to access a location close to their point of origin or destination that might vary on demand. That really increases the flexibility of the service. It also helps reduce infrastructure costs. You don't need to be building fixed infrastructure. It also helps to reduce wait and ride time because people can be dropped off at a location that helps to balance their time to access the system, but also optimizes vehicles' route at the same time. I will point out that there are definitely going to be some locations that would have fixed stops, and we'll point it out a couple of locations that are particularly high generators of travel, and they would likely have fixed stop locations. Next thing we looked at was, just in how bookings would happen, and along with most of these deployments, we assumed that real-time on-demand booking would be the preferred mode as requested, and that followed directly from the engagement process that Will discussed earlier. We also assumed that fares would be fully integrated with the conventional transit system, as opposed to some implementations of on-demand, which position this kind of service as a premium. Given that there's no existing transit service in the area, this is really something that is designed to make transit more attractive, making sure that it's easy to use and get people to where they need to go affordably. We also assume that service would use small vehicles, so either vans or cutaway buses, and we needed to do that because it's an important input to the microsimulation process. We assume that this would be a predominantly first and last mile service. So in other words, it's predominantly a way for residents of Breslau to get to and from the rest of the GRT network to get to where they're going within the service area. However, we did allow for a small proportion of riders to travel within Breslau. So for example, students who happen to live in the area or people getting to some of the small format retail that's in the area as well. And lastly, in developing our ridership revenue and cost forecasts, we assumed that there would be a 3-month ramp-up period during which ridership would be lower. And that obviously has implications on net operating cost and revenue as well. And really, that's just to reflect time to build awareness and familiarity with the system. Next slide, please. So I mentioned previously, we developed 3 different scenarios that slice and dice those 1,600 available service hours. The first scenario, scenario 1, was designed to maximize the number of weekday service hours and assumed to run for only 6 months, but provided for 12 hours of service during the day. Scenario 2 was similar to scenario 1, but would only run for a longer period of time, 8 months. And finally, scenario 3 would also run for 8 months, but it would provide service on both weekends and weekdays. And this comes at the expense of service span during the week. We only had a 6.5-hour span in scenario 3. All of these scenarios assume 1 vehicle, which is broadly appropriate for a service area of this size and the demand that was projected. Next slide, please. So we mentioned before that we evaluated the scenarios against metrics that were derived from GRT's research, and we also did additional research looking at guidance from Metrolinx, who have a microtransit guidebook, and there's also practical experience coming out of the United States through the Transit Cooperative Research Program. So we grouped the metrics into 5 categories that consider both the operator and customer perspective. Service productivity and financial performance are metrics that are considered from the operating perspective. And then service availability, level of service, and service quality are metrics that were considered from the customer perspective. Next slide, please. So in the end, scenario 2, which is the 8-month weekday only scenario, ended up being the preferable option, basically because it checks a lot of the boxes that we were just talking about. It maximized the length of the pilot. It also offered a good amount of service during the day, while also providing that service during the highest productivity periods of the day. Next slide, please. So just very quickly, I know we're running out of time here, but just to provide a little bit more detail about scenario 2, it was picked as the most desirable, given the characteristics that I just mentioned. It provides off-peak service to a greater degree than some of the other scenarios. It had the highest overall ridership and also had good financial performance. You can see the fare box recovery here on the table on the right is approaching that 10% figure that I quoted earlier. And again, productivity is in keeping with typical ranges that have been observed in practice. So, between 3 and 5 rides per revenue hour. And just very quickly, GRT has taken this a step further. So from our work where we left off, they've begun to refine the operations plan. So in the bottom left corner here, they've started to think about, beyond the fact that there's going to be, 9 hours of service roughly a day for this pilot. How are you going to divvy that up throughout the day? So the service has been designed around 2 primary shifts covering the AM peak period and the PM peak period. And those times have been designed to maximize when demand is highest, given the characteristics of the school and the meatpacking plant and other major trip generators in the area. So I think that's it.
Yeah, thanks, David. And I'll just quickly, I know we're running out of time. So these are sort of the things that I need to do now and GRT that we need to focus on. So David mentioned stop locations. We need to, as much as, they're going to shift around to kind of maximize efficiency, we need to be sure that there's some level of accessibility that's communicated to the customer. We also have to procure this technology. So that's coming shortly. And then, of course, we've also heard that there's never enough training, never enough communication to the customers, training of customer service staff, operational staff, that type of thing. So, we do have a little bit of experience with this, and we'll be working on those things over the coming months. We're aiming to launch this early next year. We'll see how things shake out with these tasks. But yeah, we're really excited, and thanks so much for your time here today. And to IBI for your support with this project, and of course, Metrolinx as well.
Okay, thanks, Will. Just to wrap up, we just want to thank you all for your time today. Apologies, as it turns out, we had a lot of content to go through. Hope you found it informative. There isn't really time to get into a Q&A in the couple of minutes that we have left. I'm sure you'll appreciate time for a quick break before your next meeting. It was our pleasure to organize this for you today. And if you have any follow-up questions, for any of the presenters or ourselves, please get in touch with myself or Karen at Opta. With that, I guess I'll turn it back to you, Karen.
Thanks, everyone. We'll follow up with all participants. Watch for an email with the video link and all presentations. Thank you again. Bye now.
Thanks, everyone. Bye. Have a great afternoon.